Tēnā koutou, ko Mammoth Mountain te maunga, ko Pacific Ocean at Torrey Pines te moana, no Palo Alto aho, ko Morton Raua, ko Ethel oku matua, ko Grant toku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My sincere apologies if my pronunciation was bad, and with your permission, I'll continue on the rest of my keynote in English, a little more familiar to me. I want to thank all of you, and especially the folks from Cornwall, for inviting us to New Zealand. My wife and I, Julie, this is our first trip to New Zealand. We got to experience the South Island for about a week. As you know, you have a beautiful country. I've wanted to come here for many, many years. I almost got here 35 years ago, and life took me in a slightly different direction. I've heard for my entire life how wonderful New Zealand is and New Zealanders. Both my father and Julie's father were in the Marine Corps, fought in the Pacific during the Second World War. Julie's father was injured 6 times, and after being injured in Guadalcanal, he told us about the 6 months or 5 months that he spent here in New Zealand in hospital, and all he said was, all the people are wonderful and all the women are gorgeous. And of course, he was exactly right about both of those. You've all been sitting very quietly for a few minutes, and I want to change that here because the last thing we want to do when we have 2,000 great educators together is as everybody sit quietly listening to one other bloke up on the stage talk at you the entire time. So I want to start off with this. How many Twitter users do we have out there? Yeah, a whole lot. Okay, if you're not a Twitter user, you saw somebody raise their hand next to you, I'd like you to join in with us. About 7 or 8 months ago on a Saturday morning Twitter chat in the United States, somebody posed the question, what's that one word that describes what you want the rest of your school year to be like? And I looked at some of the responses of that, and following on that, I've been asking audiences and school groups that I've visited with to contribute to this sort of crowdsourced database. I have over 2,000 of those responses now, and we're going to add about 2,000 more to them right now. So let's blow up the Twitter sphere. I'd like you to think about this very simple prompt, and there's no other way I can put it. What do you want? What's that one word that describes what you want your school to reek of? When people come and visit, or your students at the end of the day, what's that one word that describes, that you can dig down and use to describe what do you want your school to reek of? Take about 10 seconds. We're going to be very quiet for a minute, and then we're going to be noisy, and then we're going to be really noisy. Okay? So, think. When you get that word, I want you to tweet it out using I only put you don't have to use my handle, I put it up there just for the heck of it. Use hashtag OneWordK12 and the hashtag for the conference. If you aren't on Twitter, this is where it's going to get a little noisy. Tell the person next to you is on Twitter, and they can add it to their tweet, okay? So it should get a little noisy in here. Talking amongst yourselves. Get those words out, and let's blow up the Twitter sphere right now. And you've only got 30 seconds. Okay. Now, I didn't even realize they would have these things going, so that's cool. But we want to get really loud. We can't do a shout out amongst the group this entire size. So in your cohort of those people sitting anywhere close to you, turn around and let's shout out to small groups of each other what you wrote and what you heard. It should get real loud in here right now. Shout out to each other the words that you wrote and the words you heard. Look at the slide. Look at the slides that are up here. This is the word cloud that I've generated of the 2,000 words that I've gotten from your educator cousins stateside. How many of you at sort of an 80% level heard words that are similar to the ones that you're seeing up on the stage? Let's just get kind of a show of hands. Raise your hands if you're seeing a lot of similar sorts of words. Okay, that's a pretty good sense. I'm going to add all of the words that you tweeted to this database, and now we have a binational database of one word. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to think about doing at your school. Think about taking a quick survey. It'll take 2 to 3 minutes of your students, and ask them what's the one word that describes your experience or what you feel at the end of the day of a day of school. I want you to think about that for a minute and think if you think the words clouds are going to match up very well. I haven't done that yet when we're doing that right now in the States, and I'm going to publish the results of the 2 word clouds. So thank you very much for your participation, and now let me get on with why you paid me to come down here. In about 1985, which if you ever want to feel really old, look out at a crowd of folks who a bunch of them weren't even born when you say 1985. In about 1985, I wasn't working as an educator, but my entire life I have passionately believed in the transformational nature and opportunities of education. In 1985, I was working in the private sector, but I was working informally with a group of educators and really asking a very simple question. What's the difference between just going to school and really great learning? And I was on this hillside. Actually, it wasn't this hillside. I'm lying to you a little bit. It's a hillside that looks quite a bit like that with my 2 dogs one afternoon. And the discussion in education back then, as it is now, was about let's teach our students problem solving and critical thinking. And I thought to myself, what comes before problem solving and critical thinking? And the real difference between a classroom where students are just sitting there and a classroom where the students are deeply engaged and passionately want to learn is the fact that those students have found their own problems. They've asked their own questions. We've taught them to think systematically. We don't worry about the subject matter. We worry about getting them to deeply explore their own experiences and to come up with those questions that will generate that passion themselves. And so I got together with this group of educators and we took that idea. We said, this is what we want to do in our high schools, our secondary schools, as you call them. And we took it to the dean of a college of education locally in San Diego. And he essentially said, you can't do that stuff. The students won't get it. And with that sort of being shot down, with that failure, my life took a different turn. I always look back at that time and said, you know, if I just followed that instinct that we were right back then, by now I'd have written a lot more books than Ken Robinson did. But I didn't. With that little sort of summary background, as David said earlier, the world is changing at a dramatic rate. This curve can describe a lot of things, and I'm not going to sort of re-argue and relitigate the point that the world is changing. This curve can describe Moore's law, which has to do with technology. It also can describe just the rate of increase of human knowledge. By most calculations, by the year 2020, the sum of human knowledge will be doubling every year. Now, I was not a great math student in school, but doubling every year is a really, really huge number. We are in the knowledge business. We as educators are in the knowledge business. And we have to take this sort of thing into account, that the sum of human knowledge will be doubling every year. What is it that we're trying to teach? Secondly, as far back as we can think in human history, education has been largely about one thing. It's been about the transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a student. And that teacher may have been a shaman or a priest or the best hunter in the village or the medicine woman. It may have been a lecturer or a formal teacher or a coach or a parent. But it's primarily been about the transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a student. That relationship, that fundamental relationship, has been broken because of this thing. Education is not about technology. Innovation is not about technology. But the fact is that the vast majority of, I assume your students, certainly our students in the States, have one of these in their pocket, and they can access basic knowledge right here. They don't need us to provide them with basic knowledge. Right now, 4 billion people in the world have a cell phone, and within a relatively few number of years, those 4 or 5 billion people will have smartphones and they'll be able to access that knowledge. So if we're going to maintain relevancy, if we're going to be relevant as institutions, as schools, we have to come up with something other than the transfer of knowledge. And the third point I want to make is, and then I'm going to get off kind of the existential stuff. The third point I want to make is this. Worldwide, we recognize now that we are in a period of what Shoshana Zuboff and others have called mutation. It's very simply this. It's a fundamental change in the relationship between producers and consumers. In the past, large institutions, corporations, industries have essentially, that produce goods and services, have essentially said, this is what we have to sell, you're going to buy it. And we all did. The best example, the sort of metaphorical example of this, is the music industry. 8, 10 years ago, Sony Records said, here's a CD, it's got 12 songs on it, it costs 15 or 20 bucks, you're going to buy it, and we all did. Steve Jobs and Apple and iTunes comes along and says you can buy that song and that song and that song, whichever ones you choose, and the revenues of the American music industry with respect to sales of music dropped by 80% in 3 years. That's a fundamental mutation in an industry, and we see that across many, many sectors. Finance, retail, healthcare, certainly in the States, and we see it in education. If we go back to that curve I showed earlier, let me tell you about our area, San Diego, California. San Diego Unified School District has about 900,000 students. So I reckon that's roughly about the same number of students you have in your whole country, right? And we have in one school district. This last year, in the area described by San Diego Unified School District, 50% of the students will not go to their neighborhood school, did not go to their neighborhood school this last year. Charter schools, private schools, homeschooling, hack schooling, virtual schools, faith-based schools, et cetera. That number 20 years ago would have been in the mid-single digits. So consumers have choice. I don't think that New Zealand has probably experienced it to that degree in education yet, but there's no reason to suspect that you will not in the future. So within that context of a rapidly changing world, and about 5 or 6 years ago, the conversation amongst educators fundamentally changed. 10 years ago, most educators, at least in the States, were saying, yeah, the world's changing, great, leave me alone. About 5 or 6 years ago, and maybe it had to do with the financial disruptions in 2007, 2008, 2009, the conversation fundamentally changed, and educators started saying, oh, blank. The world really is changing, and we need to do something about it or we're going to become irrelevant. It was within that context that I took another big risk in my life. I begged forgiveness of my wife, most importantly, in advance. I packed up my car. I took advantage of the one thing that every educator wishes they had more of, which is, okay. I've used that line now in front of approximately 10,000 educators, and I've never heard one word other than time. Now, that's really important. Now, everybody else is going, yeah, no, money, salary, yeah, we were going to say that too. But the first word that comes is always time. Our children are grown, they're being successful, and I said, look, the conversation has finally changed to where I'd hoped it had been in 1985, and I want to be closer to the center of gravity of that conversation. So I packed up my car, I drove around the country for 89 days. I visited 64 schools in my Prius. I have no idea what 48.3 miles per gallon works out to in kilometers per liter, but somebody will do that and tell me. Anyway, it's good mileage. I visited all types of schools. I visited large schools, small schools, private schools, public schools, K-6, K-12, lots of different types of schools. And I really was just asking them a couple of fundamental questions. This was not the easiest thing I've ever done. There was a time, now you all don't know where Kansas is, but it's out there kind of in the middle of the Midwest, and I was thinking this morning, there's nowhere in New Zealand that you can get as far away from anything as you can in the middle of Kansas. I mean, it's the middle of nowhere. You'd have to go to Australia to get that far away from everything else. Driving across the plains in the evening, the rain started coming down, it started getting dark, and all the lights in my Prius dashboard came on at once. And they don't know a whole lot in Kansas about fixing hybrid vehicles. They know a lot about big diesel trucks. That was not fun. About 10 days into the trip, I called Julie and I said, you know what, I just don't know if I can do this for another 11 weeks. This is tough. I'm visiting schools. Every night I would get back to my hotel. I'd write a 1,000-word blog. I'd download my video, take my notes, figure out where I was staying the next day, put in my GPS coordinates, call somebody. And this was going on day after day after day. I started getting tired, but then I started getting in a rhythm. And you know what that rhythm was caused by? Because every school I was visiting, I was the lucky guy who got to walk in and say, show me what you're excited about. Take me to that classroom or that teacher that you're just fired up, that you wish the rest of your school was looking like this in the future to prepare our kids for this rapidly changing world. And that just re-energized me every day. Here are the 3 questions I essentially was asking. What does innovation mean to you? Because I'd heard people talk about, oh, we have to be innovative in schools, but nobody ever told me what that actually meant. What does innovation mean to you? Tell me about some of those obstacles that you've had to overcome, and share some of your successes. And so this story, this book that some of you have already bought, and I'm not asking you all to run out. Well, yeah, I am. Go out and read the book. You should. I get like a nickel every time it sells, so I'm not going to dinner on it. But this is not my story. This is the story of the hundreds and hundreds of educators just like yourselves who I was fortunate enough to interface with. And I can't go through the details of that right now. I'm going to hit some of the high points, and I do urge you, there's a lot in there. There's 90,000 words in there of what educators like you want to see in the future of education. So let me just hit some of the highlights. What are schools starting to look like more? We're starting to be much more dynamic places. Students aren't just sitting nicely like you're doing, sitting nicely in your row, listening politely to the teacher. We're getting up out of our chairs. We're working together. We're making our learning visible. The students are up and collaborating. You don't like to sit where you're sitting for 7 hours a day, and I guarantee your students don't like to either. The first thing I look for when I visit a school and we're looking to see what the level of engagement of students is how much time are they sitting down and how much time are they up doing something else. We're starting to take some risks in school. In the past, risk has been about, oh my God, oh my goodness, are we putting our students in some sort of danger? That's not what risk needs to mean. We need to have, and we're going to have conversations about that in a couple of my workshops later today and tomorrow. I visited a school where the little kids, I don't know the equivalent grade level for you, but pre-K, it's like 4 and 5-year-olds, right? They were having Take It Apart Tuesday in this class. That meant that the teacher had gone to the junkyard and bought a bunch of stuff and brought it back and told the kids, rip this stuff apart to see what it looks like. But, by the way, they did have Make It Monday also. It wasn't just about destroying stuff. And in this class, there was a little boy and girl, and they had a old computer keyboard, and the boy had a screwdriver and the girl had a hammer. And that girl is beating on this keyboard, and the little boy is popping keys off, and they're flying all over the room. And the look of passion and engagement and excitement on that kid's face, that's the look we want to have in every kid's face every day. And I turned to the teacher and I said, isn't this a little bit, risky? You've got a kid with a hammer and a kid with a screwdriver and, whacking the same thing at the same time. And she said, yeah, it is. But what better place for us to learn a little bit about the interaction of hammers and fingers than right here in a safe and controlled environment in my class. I go, there you go. We're becoming much more adaptive, and I use that word to describe the relationship between the school and the world around us. The world is not parsed into subject areas. That's not the way the world works. And I'm going to show you some actual data later on that suggests that this is, if we were to ask all of you this question, one of the things that you would most like to see in your schools, that we teach the way the world actually works. Interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary courses. Steve Moldy's down here from Hobsonville Point, who is basically one of the reasons I'm here, is nodding away because they have blown up the idea of subject-based curriculum. I visited a school, and I know I'm going to see this when I visit Hobsonville Point. I visited a school where a student said to me, Mr. Lichtman, at our school, we don't have to turn our math brain off and then turn our science brain on and then turn that off and then turn our social studies brain on, because all of those subjects are tracked together the way the world really works. We're becoming much more permeable to the world around us. This idea that you leave the world and then go to school and then go back to the world that afternoon or over the summer or over break is of course ridiculous. Schools are starting to be much more permeable and connected to their communities. I visited schools, they're called expeditionary schools, and maybe you even have some here in New Zealand that follow this sort of credo, where the students spend 20, 30, 35% of their time the entire year not on campus. They're out in the community, whether that be a rural setting or a very urban setting. They're out working in the community, developing projects, learning their content through the experience of being off campus, of breaking that boundary of between campus and world. And when I asked the teachers, I said, so how do your kids do on their standardized exams? Because they're spending 30% less time sitting in front of the whiteboard learning their times tables or whatever it is. The teacher said to me, they do just fine. In fact, they're doing better because they're placing that learning experience within a context of something that they're interested in doing. And of course, we're becoming much more creative in the classroom. And let me just say, creativity is not about putting a makerspace classroom in your school, chucking a 3D printer in there and saying we're being creative. We can be creative, we can make in every subject area. We can make across subject areas. I told this story in my TEDx talk, and I just have to tell it again because it's so wonderful. So I'm in this school in Atlanta with a second grade boy, and we're sitting on those little bitty chairs that little second graders sit on, which means my knees are about at my chin. And I asked him, I said, so what do you do when you come to this space? What do you do when you think about making and creating and being creative? And he kind of screwed up his face and thought for a second. And he goes, well, we ideate and we prototype and we build and we fail forward and we fail fast. And that's what we do. And I said, okay, that little boy, that kid is never going back into the box again in his entire life. We have not stolen from him that innate creativity and passion to make and design and think and create that children are born with. And so at the end of the road, as is my wont, because I believe in synthesis, I had to try to synthesize. What does all this mean? And let me tell you, that last leg, you don't know the geography, but the leg of the journey after my last school back to San Diego, from Texas to San Diego, that is a long 2-day drive. By yourself across, it's like driving from, I don't know, somewhere to Darwin in Australia. There's nothing there. You drink a lot of Pepsi to stay awake. And so I thought, how do I synthesize all this? I got it down to a paragraph. I got it down to a sentence. I started throwing words away. I got it down to 3 words, and I finally got it down to 1 word. I hadn't seen anything on this trip. Remember, I had gone to these schools and I said, show me what you believe is the most innovative element of your school. What's the pilot project around which you'd like learning to nucleate, the direction you would like to go, the things you'd like to percolate out throughout your school system. The only thing I said was, don't show me just a one-to-one rollout iPad, something like that, that related to technology. I didn't see a single one of those that John Dewey would not have been, yep, see, that's what I was telling you 100 years ago. You should have been listening back then. John Dewey, Maria Montessori, Francis Parker, the greats of the progressive era of education, who essentially said, great learning is based on experience that leads to engagement, that leads to passion, that leads to learning. And this is what was the common element of all these little bits and pieces that I'd seen at all these schools. It was what Dewey and the other greats of the progressive era were telling us 100 plus years ago, and unfortunately we've largely forgotten. And so when I take those words that describe some of those elements I was talking about, and by the way, I had to ask Julie forgiveness for one other thing at this point. I asked her if I could screw a couple big bulletin boards into the nice white wall in our family room because I like to think visually, and I don't think she's still not very happy about that. But that's my office. These are the words that, when I look, and this is the geologist, the environmental scientist in me, these are the words we use to describe the success and failure and characteristics of natural ecosystems. They're fundamentally different words than the words that we use to describe industrial systems, the industrial system that was created in the middle of the 19th century that it formats essentially our traditional education. These two systems, the reason we struggle over this change, the reason we struggle over transformation is these two systems are fundamentally incompatible at a systematic level. You can't tweak the words on the red part of that slide, tweak them a little bit, the margins, and come up with the words on the blue side. You have to look at a fundamental change in the system. And so here I want to put this as clearly as I can. Traditional education, our factory model, our assembly line model of education that was formatted in the middle of the 19th century is about taking a child at a particular age, putting them into a box on an assembly line. The assembly line is calibrated to move forward at one increment per year of biologic age, and that box that they're in is formed by the sides of this much time that they spend in each class, the subjects that they spend, the classroom space itself, and a teacher in that space with those students. That's the quantum packet. That's the box that moves along the assembly line. If you want to transform your schools, just blow up your assumptions about those elements. That's where you start. You blow up your assumptions about time, space, subject, and the student-teacher ratio in the classroom, and you can begin to transform your school. That's what education has looked like in the past. This is of all the pictures I took, this is the picture I choose to say, this is what I think education looks like now at those schools that were taking me and saying, that's what we wish it would look like. The kids are up out of their seats, they're writing on an idea wall, they're working with each other, they're making their learning visible, they're creating stuff. Yeah, there's words on there that aren't spelled right and all that, we don't care, but it's a different form of relationship in the classroom. What do I think education is going to look like in the future? If there's one slide I'd like you to walk away from here, it's this one. I coined this word a couple of years ago, and if any of you teach Latin or studied Latin, you go, yeah, the Latin, the cognitosphere, the Latin is sketchy. I was never a Latin scholar, so I don't have to worry about that. It's essentially the evolving neural network. It's evolving right now amongst everybody in the world that has connectivity with each other. Many of you are part of the cognitosphere right now. It didn't exist 10 years ago. It's evolving right this minute. And what flows through this network, which flows through those things that look like connected neurons, is knowledge. It's a neural network that involves the creation, transfer, sharing, management, archival of knowledge in a space where that connectivity exists that never existed up until 10 years ago. If we want to be relevant and successful in the future, you, your students, your schools, you want to be one of those big nodes in the cognitosphere. You don't want to be off on one of those little fine capillaries somewhere. You need to be part of this system because that is going to be how we think of learning and education in the future. So what holds us back from all this as educators? What holds us back from making this transformation, from making this change? The two big ones are fear and inertia. And if you look at the science and the art of organizational change management, these are the two words that are described that hold back innovation, transformation in every organization. Schools have a special relationship with this concept of fear. There has always been a greater downside to taking a risk in a school than there has been an upside. For students, I remember the big red F that I got on a test, math test, when I was in second grade. And I remember the F that I got on my first chemistry exam at university. There's always been a greater downside to fail as a student. You as a teacher, am I really going to take risks with my students, your administrators, et cetera? So we have this special relationship with fear, and we cannot innovate without taking risks. It's as simple as that. We're going to be working on that in one of my workshops later on. And the other one is inertia. On the one hand, we've been pretty darn good at what we've done. You all have been very, very successful at what you've done in the past, and the more successful you've been, the harder it is to change. People go, why should you change? I've got to tell you this. So, time out. Julie and I are on the bow of a ship last week in Milford Sound, and it was a gorgeous day. I mean, no clouds, it was windy, it was beautiful. We're on the bow of this ship, and these really nice Kiwi family introduces themselves to us, asks us what we're doing there, all that sort of thing. Mom and dad and 2 kids. And so we told them we're on vacation. I said, well, I'm going to be presenting and working at this big educator workshop up. And they were from Auckland. They'd never been to Milford Sound before, which blew me away. Anyway, the mom says, after about a minute, the mom comes back to me and says, so you're going to be talking to those educators? And I said, yeah. Well, I hope you don't put any big strange ideas into their heads, because our kids just need to really learn math and reading a lot better. And I invited her here. I said, you want to come up on the stage with me? We can have that discussion. Which is, of course, the big false dichotomy that we think we have to make a choice between experience, passion, engaged students, and doing well on standardized exams. And of course, that's a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. But we've done well in the past. The better we've done in the past, it's harder to change. And of course, we're buffeted by all sorts of political winds that I'm sure are just as difficult here as they are in the States, that sort of keep things from changing in one direction, in a direction that we actually want to go as educators. But there are a couple of other things that hold us back. And these are 2 that I found on the trip that are specific to schools. One, I call them the anchors. These are the anchors that you, most of us teachers, feel that attach us to the idea of time, space, and subject. This is my classroom, my time, and my subject. So please let me do my job. I'm not saying it's a bad sense, but those are anchors that are holding us to a world that doesn't exist any longer. And what I found was, when I talked to teachers who let go those anchors, who cut those anchor chains, they actually said the weight of the world was off their shoulders. That's not my job anymore. My job, and I'll get to that in a minute. And the other one is silos. 5, 6 years ago, in front of a group of educators, if we talked about silos, we would have thought about these things that sit out in the field and hold grain, tall things that hold grain. We know now that silos are the boundaries that exist between us and amongst us. We have so many silos in schools, and they're so powerful. We have the silo of classroom, subject area, grade level, department, division, faculty, administrators, students, parents. All of those boundaries that exist, and we know that organizations cannot transform without connectivity, and silos stand in the way of connectivity, period. So these are the real elements that have kept, that make transformation difficult. And so there came a time about 2/3 of the way through the trip that I had a real pivot point. And I've told this story. If you've heard of my TEDx talk, I apologize, but I'm going to tell it again because I think it's so important. For 2/3 of the trip, every school I visited, we talked about, oh, but change is hard. And this is black letter law. Change is hard. Organizations go through the stages of change, and there's grief, and there's reconstruction, and all this sort of thing. And we sort of empower ourselves with that idea that change is hard. And so one day, I was at a school in South Carolina, which, by the way, I hope they're okay, because they may be under about 8 feet of water right now. Seriously, they're right down on the coastline of South Carolina. I was at this school, had the whole administrative group with me, and one of the principals at this school literally had her head in her hands. And she said, Grant, why is this so hard? Why is it so hard to do what we want to do? And so we had the discussion about stages of grief and all that sort of thing. Later that afternoon, I'm driving up through the woods, the piney woods of South Carolina, with the sun setting in my windscreen. And I started thinking about, it started coming to me, what's really hard in life? And part of it had been because I've been reading a couple books, and I thought to myself, you know, our parents' generation, fighting the war in the Pacific and kicking the Nazis out of Europe, that was hard. And those settlers that had settled the plains of Kansas, where my car broke down, settling those plains in 1840 and surviving winters, that was hard. And a single mother raising children in poverty, that's really hard. And because I've been reading a book about Americans in Afghanistan, I said, and you know, in going as a young person to stand your post in the dirt in Afghanistan or Iraq or some of the places you send your young men and women, that's really hard. And as a parent, saying goodbye to those kids before they do that, that's really hard stuff. You have your own thoughts that come to you about what's hard in life. Changing schools is uncomfortable. It's not hard, and we need to really adjust to that. I'd urge you to have that discussion at your school. Is it really hard for us to change what we're doing, or is it uncomfortable? And if it's uncomfortable, which it is, let's embrace that discomfort. Let's embrace what that takes. Let's get comfortable with discomfort. So how do we get there? How do we make these transformations? I think it really comes down to this. It's about building capacity and comfort with change, comfort with discomfort. And it starts right here with you folks. I'm going to make two comments about this term educator leader. We know, David was talking about it earlier, about why Silicon Valley is so successful now in times of rapid change. And one of the most important elements is that we do not look to a leader to tell us what to do. We lead from where we are, whether we're in the classroom, the office, whether we're a student at the desk in the classroom. We lead from where we are. We're going to talk about that more in one of my workshops. We want to use these words like teacher as co-learner, as co-leader with your students. This is so critical, or the organization will not change. We don't have time for one person to say, here's the change you have to make, go implement it, and go back and forth. We have to do this organically amongst ourselves. And so I want to use another term for educator leader. I've thought about what really is the role of the teacher in the classroom. We've heard that this, we all know this, is I'm being a sage on the stage, right? And that's no good. So why am I doing it? Well, they asked me to. This isn't right. So people told us, no, the teacher should be a guide on the side. I don't like that term. I don't think it's a good use of language. I don't think it's a good image. Why? Teachers aren't on the side of anything. Teachers are smack dab in the middle of this process. And so I encourage us to use the image of teacher as farmer. What does a great farmer do, whether they're in New Zealand or in the United States? A farmer lays out a fence line, the boundary conditions. Here's the area in which we're going to live. And then that farmer goes out, and maybe if they're in an area where there's rocky soil, they get rid of some of the big rocks, or they break up the topsoil, they prepare the conditions for growth. But after that, the farmer's jobs are really pretty simple. Make sure the nutrients get to the system, and do some judicious pruning and weeding along the way. And of course, our students are these things that are growing in the farmland, the crops or the trees. So I'd urge us to be farmers, not guides on the side. We have to start off with what we actually want. How many of you at your schools have gone through some kind of a discussion about what are the skills in the 21st century that we want for our students? Raise your hand. What are the essential qualities of a graduate? Any of those sorts of things. I've studied many, many of these, and they come down to lists that look like this. Oftentimes, for some reason, that people want all the words to start with the letter C for some reason. I have no idea why. These are not indicators of success in the 21st century. These are indicators of success and happiness. They're timeless. They go back centuries or millennia. I use this list, I'm showing you this list for one reason. The school I was at, we had that discussion. It took the faculty a year to go through the discussion and sort out which words we thought were the right words and which weren't. This list was generated by 3 groups of high school students, total elapsed time 9 minutes. And I'll bet you that group, I bet most of you are going, yeah, that list is about right. It may not have all the words I would include, but it's pretty good. It's a good place to start. Let's stop worrying about what the list looks like and just start doing it. So, as I finished my trip and started working with a lot of audiences in a more active setting, which we'll be doing in the workshops later on, one of the things we do a lot is we use this very powerful question, what if? And so I started asking people, write post-it notes, which we'll do later today, write post-it notes that start with the words what if, that challenge anything you want about your school. Anything that you want as an educator, you think your school would be better if, and write that post-it note. And we would then work with it in the workshop and prototype things and all that. Well, I didn't leave those post-it notes behind. I started collecting them. Long story short, after I had 2,000 of them, I published the results. I took those 2,000 what-ifs, all from educators like yourselves. I ended up throwing out a couple hundred of them because there were things like, and I apologize to Miss Brown, who's in the room somewhere. What if we fired Miss Brown? That didn't seem to correlate well with anything else. Or what if our principal weren't such a... Threw those out. Ended up with about 1,850 of them and went through a very subjective exercise. It was me doing this, but I put them all into buckets. And I'm going to show you 2 slides. Don't worry about squinting, as I'm going to focus in on the next slide on this one. I show you this one because there wasn't a heck of a lot of disagreement. 70% of the results, 70% of those what-if questions, blue sky, ask whatever you want, mapped into just 10 areas. There's not a huge dissonance about what we want schools to look like in the future. We pretty much agree. And what were those 10? What did I say earlier? The first one by far was we want to stop teaching the way the world doesn't work. We want to be vastly more interdisciplinary, work with our colleagues more, plan lessons in an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary mode. We want our students to own that learning process. We're not owning it for them. They need to take ownership of it. Student assessment. In the United States now, I don't know what it is here, in the United States, we have roughly 2 grades. We have A and not A. And they're given out about equally. About 50% of grades in America are A and the other half are something else. So that's obviously a completely worthless assessment process. So revising the student assessment process, the daily schedule. On those Post-it notes that I put into this bucket of daily schedule, the 2 words that showed up more than any other were blow up. Nobody said, give me 5 more minutes in the daily schedule to teach my subject. They said, blow up the daily schedule and start over. Because if you were starting a new school, some of you in Christchurch are going to get this wonderful, not because of the cause of it, but an opportunity to start new schools. You're not going to start with a schedule where the day's carved up into 50-minute pieces, I hope. And on down the list. Those are the elements that your colleagues in the United States overwhelmingly say, this is what we want. And so schools that are starting now are able to do that, and schools that are transforming need to get there. I'm almost done. We're going to get wrapped up. This slide looks very complicated, but it's not. I've stolen a graphic that has evolved over the last 25 or 30 years in terms of organization innovation. It essentially says there are a series of stages, a series of steps that an organization has to go through in order to be successful in innovation and change. And I've adapted this to specifically the school experience. It essentially says, look, we need strong leadership. We need leadership that's willing to take a risk, that's willing to put themselves out there. We need to create a vision that understands that the world has changed around us and that we need to prepare our students for that. And on and on. We need to be inclusive in the process. The bad news is that any one of those steps is a possible weak link, is a possible break in the chain. You have to have all of them. If you don't have all of them, you don't get up to the top right-hand corner, which is success. And I've published this graphic. It's on my website under resource pages. You can get it from there. The good news is that almost every school I go to is really, really good at a lot of these. But maybe they need to work on 1, or maybe they need to work on 2. And that gives you focus. And that gives you an opportunity, a place to start by self-assessing what you've already done and what you need to do in the future. So, I want to wrap up with just a couple things here. Here's the big challenge that I put out to all of us, and it's non-trivial. It's absolutely non-trivial. We have spent, over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, a tremendous amount of time on thinking about what I call the hardware of the system of education. What should campuses look like? We spend, in the United States, billions of dollars building new facilities. You've spent a tremendous amount of money wiring your schools, providing technological infrastructure, et cetera. You are part of the hardware. You are part of the hardware. If you think of a school as a computer system, the teachers are one of the most important parts of the hardware of the system. We've spent a lot of time and energy thinking about that. And we've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy thinking about and revising the software of the system. I found out last night that you folks aren't actually driven by textbooks. Thank God. In the United States, huge driver of what we do in the classroom is driven by the textbooks publishers. And now it's software and it's applications, et cetera, et cetera. What have we not paid attention to? We have not rebuilt the basic operating system of education since about the year 1850. The basic operating system that I described earlier of taking kids, moving them along this assembly line within this quantum packet of time, space, subject, etc., the way we grew up, because it was comfortable for us, that basic system has not been renegotiated and reformatted in 150 years. And that's the challenge that we all have. I'm hearing some incredibly exciting things about how you all in New Zealand are doing that, and I think very possibly are helping to lead that globally, and I hope you will in the future. And so let me just finish up with this. I use this word a lot in my book, in Ed Journey, and it's great news. Every school I visited, I did not visit schools because they were known to be necessarily innovative or radical or any of that kind of stuff. Most of the schools I visited because they said yes. I was just a guy driving his car around the country. I'm not anybody. I'm not famous or anything like that. They had no reason to invite me to their school. But every school I visited, they could show me something that was so powerfully different that they were saying that's what we want to do in the future. The bad news was sometimes you'd go down to the end of that hall and I'd see what wonderful Miss Brown was doing. It was exciting and fabulous and all that. The people down at the other end of the hall didn't even know what was going on. So there are these brush fires of innovation burning everywhere. You have them throughout New Zealand. We have them throughout the world. You folks are connected with your colleagues via the blogosphere and via Twitter. These people want to share with you and they need to learn from you. There are many, many stories in my book. There's a lot of narrative examples in the book. Every one of those folks in the book is willing to reach out and connect with you, and they would learn valuably from you if you would reach out and connect with them. These brush fires are everywhere. They have not yet created a conflagration of change, and that's what we have to do. That's our charge ahead. It doesn't work. It's not going to work if we just say, there's a fire burning. 20 years from now, maybe it will have grown into something. We're too good for that. We know too much about what it is we want to do. I expect there's going to be a tremendous amount of that going on this week at the conference. I'm so happy to help be part of that and learn from you. I really appreciate your attention this morning. I look forward to conversing with you more. Thank you very much. Kia ora.